Hello, and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Weinberg. This time we will continue our reading of Summer at Fairacre with Miss Reed. Early April was at its best that year, with far more sunshine than showers. I spent happy hours in the garden. The hawthorn hedge had put forth small leaves on crimson stalks, and the polyanthus plants glowed red and yellow in the border. Arabis and aubrietta added mats of white and purple, and already the air was beginning to grow heady with the scent of flowers and new grass. What can beat a warm English spring? Perhaps we cherish it more because it is so rare these days, I thought, picking a minute white violet from under the hedge and inhaling its fragrance. I remembered Mr. Willett's theory that the earth had tilted, which resulted in the chilly weather we had been enduring. When the sun shone so tenderly upon us, it was hard to remember those bitter days of only a week or two earlier. I lived blissfully in the present, and drove over to visit Miss Clare at Beech Green. Dolly Clare must be the best-loved person for miles around. For years she has taught at Fairacre School, and I was fortunate enough to find her in serene charge of the infants class when I became headmistress of the school. Ill health forced her to retire to the little thatched cottage at Beech Green, some 2 or 3 miles away. She had been a young child of 6 when she first went to live there with her parents and sister Ada. Always the little house seemed welcoming. The furniture gleams in winter, a fire cheers the room, and always, whatever the season, there are flowers. In the darkest days of January, Dolly Clare still manages to find some sprigs of yellow winter jasmine or a bowl of indoor bulbs to delight herself and her visitors. I've always loved the cottage, and not so long ago Dolly staggered me by telling me that she had left it to me in her will. What such generosity means to me I cannot express adequately. All I know is that I was moved to tears, a rare occurrence for me, and I am still overwhelmed by my undeserved good fortune. On this fine spring afternoon, I took with me a posy of polyanthus and a pot of freshly made lemon curd. There was a scent of spring in the air, and the lane between Fairacre and Beech Green wound between hedges hazy with young leaf. With still over a week of holiday before me, I sang as blithely as the lark above me, if not quite as tunefully. Miss Clare looked as pretty as ever. Despite her great age, her eyes were bright and her skin clear. To my delight, I found a fine black cat sitting in an armchair. "And who is this?" "Well, my dear, he's been living rough around here for some months, and during the winter I put out a little straw bed in a wooden box the greengrocer gave me. I put it in the woodshed and left the window open, and he used it every night, you know." "I bet he did. And I suppose he found a good supper there, too?" Dolly Clare laughed. "Of course he did. And top and bottom of it is, he moved in here a week or 2 ago, and he's such a dear I really must take him on." He certainly was a handsome animal, and graciously allowed me to stroke him. "He's found a good spot," I observed. "What will you do if you go away?" "I'm not likely to go far at my age," said Dolly, "and I've some kind neighbors. Luckily he eats anything. More than I can say for my pernickety Tibby. Now sit down and tell me all the Fairacre news." I embarked on the ever-enthralling village concerns, such as Mrs. Partridge's plot to get me on the panel game, Mr. Willett's garden, Mrs. Maugham's continued absence in Ireland, a jumble sale threatened for next week, Mr. Annett the choir-master's tribulations with the Easter anthem, Miss Briggs' approaching marriage, and finally, poor Mrs. Cogg's trials with Arthur in prison. "Best place for him," said Dolly calmly, "but I don't know that she'll be any better off without him, except that she should be less afraid. That poor soul will never be able to cope with life." Bob Willett seemed to think she'd be better off financially anyway, without Arthur taking his earnings such as they are to the pub nightly. Dolly shook her head. I doubt it. She has no idea of management. Years ago, when the family was arriving thick and fast, Alice Willett and I had a talk with her about cheap, nourishing food to buy, and how best to manage the little bit of money she had weekly. We even offered to mine some of it for her to keep it out of Arthur's clutches, but it was quite hopeless. We used to give her clothes, too, things she could cut down for the children. Dear Alice even taught her to knit and gave her wool and needles to make simple things like mittens for the children and scarves, but it was all beyond her. In the end, we faced the fact that nothing practical could be done to help her. We just gave a hand when a crisis occurred. But those pathetic children, they're the ones I grieve for. Me too, I said, particularly Joseph. Perhaps she simply lacked early training, continued Dolly. I know our family was quite as poor when we were young. As you know, my father never earned much at his job as a thatcher, and when he had his accident, things were pretty desperate. But somehow my mother managed. We were always clean and tidy, and there was something in the pot for dinner, usually a rabbit given us by a kind neighbor, or some good soup made from bones with lots of vegetables from the garden. We never went hungry, and we learned to be happy with very little. I honestly never remember being sorry for myself. My sister Ada and I thought we had a lovely home, and so we did. She rose and went into the kitchen to put on the kettle. I followed her and looked appreciatively at the sunny room, which would one day, far, far ahead, I sincerely hoped, be my own. From the rafters near the window hung some drying herbs and a string bag with last season's onions. A row of blue and white striped china pots stood on the shelf near the stove, labeled currants, tea, sugar, coffee, and salt. A fat brown teapot stood beside the kettle waiting to be warmed, and on the brick floor there was a generous helping of milk in an enamel pie dish for Dolly's new companion. I simply love this house, I said impulsively. That's why I'm so glad you're going to have it, said Dolly, pouring a silver stream into the teapot. That evening I pondered on Mrs. Coggs as seen through Dolly Clare's eyes. My old friend and Alice Willett were both warm-hearted realists. They must have spent many hours and much energy in trying to train Joseph Coggs' mother into more methodical ways. I liked the calm way in which Dolly had told me that they soon realized that their efforts were fruitless. There was no recrimination against their poor pupil, and no self-pity about the time wasted on her. There was simply this sensible acceptance of a hopeless case, but an awareness, too, of their own neighborly duty to the family should any crisis occur. I could not help thinking that Mrs. Coggs must have been heartened by the kindness and support of these two good women, even if her home and family still appeared as slovenly and neglected as ever. I felt pretty sure, too, that Dolly Clare and Alice Willett must have helped Mrs. Coggs with an occasional gift of money, as well as the more usual presents of garden produce which we are all proud to offer to our neighbors. Teachers are not rich people, and Dolly would never have earned much compared with college-trained and certificated colleagues, for she was of the old pupil-teacher category. Nevertheless, she was always neatly dressed, never in debt, and managed to find something to give to those less fortunate, like Mrs. Coggs. Her example made me feel a positive spendthrift. It was true that I was never seriously in debt, that my wardrobe was respectable, though nowhere near as extensive and elegant as dear Amy's, and that my home was reasonably furnished, but I should never be the careful manager of money that Dolly Clare was. I suppose, I thought ruefully, I fall somewhere between Dolly and Mrs. Coggs for financial efficiency. There are feckless bodies in all walks of life, of course, and I was reminded of a passage in one of William Howard Russell's letters to his wife. He was writing from the Crimea in 1856 in one of his rare free moments from following the campaign for the Times. Obviously, his wife Mary was adding to his anxieties by her imprudent spending, and I liked the diplomatic way he expressed his concern. Riches, he writes, are not happiness indeed, but there is great difficulty in living happy without them. A universal truth indeed, and one which poor Mrs. Coggs would undoubtedly endorse. I was beginning to count the few remaining precious days of the Easter holiday with as much concentration as a miser with his gold. Half the things I had intended to do remained undone, but I had cleaned all the windows, defrosted the refrigerator, made 4 pots of lemon curd, and parted with the more disreputable of my garments for the benefit of the approaching jumble sale. My chief accomplishment was the partial routing of Mrs. Pringle's intent upon the dreaded spring cleaning. I made the jumble sale a useful excuse. "Just the sitting room," I implored her. "I've so much sorting out to do on the dining room table, and I promised to write the labels this time, so I shall be in your way if we try to do too much." I feared that this was a feeble defense and would fall before Mrs. Pringle's implacable front, but to my surprise she agreed. "Give me a chance to get to grips with it in there, anyway," she conceded. "I don't suppose you've ever given the woodwork on them chairs a nice rub over with vinegar and water." "Well, no," I admitted. "Then that's what they'll get now," she said flatly, making for the sink. "I'll start the overall bottomin' when you're back in school," she continued. "The top of them pelmets of yours could grow potatoes, I don't doubt, up there in your bedroom. Good thing you're not aspergic to dust and dirt. You'd be a hospital case in no time." Reprieved from the complete chaos of spring cleaning, I meekly said nothing in my defense and tried to turn a deaf ear to the horrific bangings which emanated from the sitting room. I escaped into the garden and reveled in the spring weather. No doubt, as soon as term started, we should get a return to the Arctic conditions we had endured in March, but meanwhile it was bliss to hear the lambs bleating in the distance and to watch the rooks building their ramshackle nests near the church spire. Did they recognize the gilded weathercock nearby as an inanimate kinsman, I wondered? Mr. Willett spent an afternoon with me, and we planted a row of new potatoes with some Celtic names such as Arran Pilot or Ulster Chieftain, which Mr. Willett assured me were the only really tasty ones to be grown in our soil. We also planted peas and carrots, and I had visions of modest dinner parties with the vegetable dishes overflowing with my own produce. But the greatest thrill of all came 3 days before term started. As I shook out my tablecloth after breakfast, there was the unmistakable twittering of swallows, and there on the electricity wire were 2 little beauties. For the rest of the day they flashed around the house, arrows of blue-black satin plumage, and before nightfall they had rediscovered last year's nest in the front porch and were busy putting it to rights for this year's brood. What did it matter if the doorstep would be plastered with droppings, much to Mrs. Pringle's wrath? What did it matter if I had to hustle Tibby away during their rearing activities? The swallows were back, and now summer had really arrived. Chapter 6. Public Duties. The W.I. Jumble Sale took place in the village hall on Saturday afternoon. Fortunately, I was not required to man one of the stalls this time, as evidently a bevy of new helpers had volunteered for this hazardous job. One of them I saw was Miriam Quinn, who was in charge of the children's clothes stall. She smiled across the room at me as I struggled with my own offerings for the produce stall. I had managed to find some pots of marmalade, one of my precious lemon curd, a real sacrifice this, 2 cabbages, and a batch of flapjacks which I prayed had survived their journey intact and not ended up in shame-making crumbs. Mrs. Partridge was in charge of the produce and accepted my contributions enthusiastically. "Oh, how lovely! Marmalade is always a best-seller, and what superb cabbages! Just look, Mrs. James, aren't they splendid? May I sell you one for Sunday dinner?" Mrs. James looked at my offerings disparagingly. "Got better'n them up home," she announced, passing on to the next stall. Mrs. Partridge, accustomed to this sort of thing after many years as a vicar's wife, remained undismayed. Well, 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 someone else is going to be lucky, I can see. It is no wonder that our vicar's wife is unanimously chosen as president of so many village affairs. She has tact, resilience, and can rise with good humor to any emergency. I am one of her devoted admirers. Mrs. Pringle was in sole charge of the shoe and hat stall. This has been her prerogative for all the years I can remember, and she presides over it with implacable authority. Woe betide anyone foolish enough to try to bargain with Mrs. Pringle. If a pair of size 4 gray suede evening shoes with Louis heels dating from the 20s has a chalked price of 50 pence on the soles, then that is what any would-be purchaser must be prepared to pay. I once saw a stranger offer her half the marked price for a pair of Wellingtons. After Mrs. Pringle had finished with him, he made straight for the door, poor fellow. "How's it going?" I inquired of her. She rattled her pudding basin with some satisfaction. "Doing quite nicely, although there don't seem to be much call for hats these days." "People just don't wear them," I commiserated, eyeing the yellowing Panamas, a small feather pillbox with a veil, 4 identical picture hats in mauve silk with pleated brims, presumably once the get-up of 4 unfortunate bridesmaids, and several floral confections, among which I recognized a rather fetching one of my own, and was hurt to see it priced at 5 pence. Why, I paid guineas for it 10 years ago for somebody's wedding. "There's a nice one here," said Mrs. Pringle, burrowing under the pile and surfacing with a battered object which she held out for my inspection. "Crushed velvet," she said. "Suits you nicely, I reckon." Crushed, all right, I thought, and as it was a particularly dreadful beetroot color, I turned it down flat. Mrs. Pringle began to draw in her breath, ready for some verbal assault, and I fled to Miriam's stall to escape. Poor Miriam was in the clutches of a middle-aged newcomer to the village who had arrived late with her contributions to Miriam's stall and was busy shaking out children's garments and suggesting prices. "These 2 skirts shouldn't go at anything less than £1 apiece," she informed Miriam, "and I'd put a reserve of 75 pence on these blouses. I made them myself, from best quality. Viola for my granddaughters, and they're hardly worn, as you can see. These little track suits, too, are in perfect condition. A pity to part with them, but they're too small now." Miriam cast me an agonized look. The lady was busy rummaging in another of her many carrier bags, and was now producing children's shoes of all shapes and sizes. Some customers were beginning to get impatient and were besieging Miriam with upheld garments and money. I decided to come to the rescue. "Shoes," I said firmly, "have to go to Mrs. Pringle next door." She looked up with some dislike. "But these are children's shoes." "Nevertheless, all shoes have to go to Mrs. Pringle. Shall I take you to meet her?" "No, indeed. I know Mrs. Pringle quite well and can deal with her myself." She bustled off, and Miriam finished dealing with the batch of importunate customers. "That was kind of you," she said with relief. "Really, I'd no idea of the hazards of holding a stall when I took it on. As for people's exaggerated idea of the worth of the jumble they're delivering, you begin to wonder why they're parting with it." "'Twas ever thus," I quoted to her, and went to buy a cake. As usual, I was far too late to find the sort I like. It is common knowledge that the cake stall on these occasions is the first to sell out. The number of fine fruit cakes and toothsome sponges which are secreted in the shade under the table tell all too clearly of those wise people who have dropped a discreet word to the stallholders beforehand and have reserved put on these goodies. By the time I arrived, there were a few rock cakes with burnt currants in evidence, some homemade crumbly biscuits, and one large cake which I eyed doubtfully. "Madeira?" I asked Mrs. Lamb. "No, dear, it's caraway seed cake, and I can't think why it hasn't been snapped up. It's one of Alice Willett's, too." If I liked seed cake, I'd have it like a shot, I assured her, and passed on sadly. Joseph Coggs was standing by the bran tub, watching several of his schoolfellows diving for treasure. He looked wistful. "Here on your own?" I asked him. "Mum's getting shoes," he answered, nodding toward Mrs. Pringle, and sure enough there was Mrs. Coggs trying to fit the twins' feet into some of the shoes which, I suspected, had just been delivered by Miriam's tormentor. I only hoped Mrs. Coggs would be successful, and I knew that Mrs. Pringle would be sympathetic beneath her grim exterior. I fished in my purse and gave a 10-penny piece to Joseph. "Have a go, Joseph," I said. "But they's only 3 penny a go," he said. "Well, then have 3 goes." "But then there's a penny I owes you." "Keep it for luck," I said. "Thanks, miss," he said, and the smile he gave me was reward enough. Time I was off, I told him, making for the door. I was pleased to have given him pleasure. I was even more pleased to think how well his arithmetic was coming on. Once a school teacher, always a school teacher, I told myself on the way home. The first day of term dawned hazily, foretelling a fine day to come. Although, as usual, half my plans for the holidays had not materialized, I felt a certain sense of accomplishment. At least part of the house had been bottomed by Mrs. Pringle. I had written a number of neglected correspondence. The cupboards were tidy. I had worked hard in the garden and done my duty at the jumble sale. Now these activities would have to take second place to my teaching duties, and I prepared to go across the playground to start the day. With Amy's warning in mind, I carefully closed the downstairs windows of the schoolhouse and locked back and front doors. Of course, it was doubtful if the sort of mentally disturbed fellow whom Amy had described would be interested in entering my house to steal any valuables. Come to think of it, what would he find? A small silver sauce boat and a couple of silver napkin rings comprised my silver collection. Aunt Clara's seed pearl necklace was hidden in a handkerchief sachet in the drawer of my dressing table, and the only other object of value was a nice Chippendale Carver chair which I had fallen for at a local auction some years earlier. Hardly the sort of piece to be secreted by an opportunist sneak thief, particularly one who evidently wore nothing but a raincoat. However, the police had begged us to secure our property as best we could, and I felt a most virtuous glow as I walked across the school with the door key in my pocket. Mrs. Pringle, dustpan in hand, greeted me dourly. "You promised to let me have that puddin' basin back as I lent you last week with the bird food in it. I needs it for dinner today." "Damn!" I said, loudly enough to give joy to a knot of attentive children who nudged each other, happy at my lapse. I turned to retrace my footsteps, unlocked the front door, retrieved the pudding basin, and returned to the school. "There you are," I said to Mrs. Pringle, who accepted it graciously, "and many thanks for the bits and pieces." My cleaner leant towards me, her voice unusually low and confidential. "There wasn't no call to swear in front of the children. They gets quite enough of that from the telly." I took the rebuke with good grace. It was deserved. Halfway through prayers, I remembered that I had omitted to lock the front door. Ah, well. We'll see if there are any more exciting developments next time.